Okay, great. So welcome everyone. Tonight's workshop is the first of two that we're running with Erik Pinkerton to learn about editing digital photos. And I know most of you, but for the purposes of those that I don't know yet, and for anybody watching the recording, I'm Garnet Muthing, and I'm the art curator with the Department of Tourism and Culture. I oversee the department's visual art programs, and as part of that program, we offer supports for visual artists, such as professional development workshops like this one. So as I said, this is a two-part series where we're going to be learning about photo editing. And we've also offered workshops with Erik, and we've been working with Erik for years doing photography of the Yukon Permitted Art Collection and helping artists do photography specifically for their submissions. And we find that it's always a skill that people are asking about, whether it's taking their own photos or working with photos to resize and work with color and contrast in images and those kinds of things. And so we felt that this would be a great workshop so that people have skills for applications or for building their portfolios or other things that they're doing with photography of their work. So thanks for joining us, Erik. Always great to work with you. And as Erik was saying earlier before we started the recording, this is going to be a pretty informal session, so feel free to ask questions and jump in if you have comments that you'd like to respond to. I'm going to be ducking out pretty soon because I have to travel tomorrow, but I wanted to be here to welcome all of you and to thank Erik for his time tonight.
Thanks, Garnet. I'm not going to get into too much where that pretty much sums up anything I would say as well, so we'll just jump right into it. I am going to try to keep this somewhat vague because everyone is using different technology. Everyone will have different cameras, different editing software, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to try to make things make sense in more or less a general sense, which is unfortunate. You know, if you have a specific question about one very specific thing, feel free to ask me, but there's a good chance I won't accidentally touch on it. So jump right in. Hopefully this information all crosses most different editing softwares and platforms. There are going to be things that you'll probably have to work out on your own. Luckily, and we'll get into this as well, but luckily this is absolutely not new territory. We are not reinventing the wheel. As a matter of fact, we're coming nowhere near it. There are millions and millions and millions of people who know how to do this work, specifically editing photos, which means this has been covered. Probably every piece of software, every program you can think of, everything has been covered in detail on the internet. And so it's a great resource. And I still regularly, if I come up with any issues that just aren't making sense with me with one of my pieces of software or editing something, then the first thing I do is just go and ask the internet, and 99% of the time, the answer is there. It does sometimes mean reading, looking through stuff. Anyway, all I'm trying to get at is don't shy away from that. So if something isn't making sense for you later, specific to your program, then just go ahead and search for it, and you'll probably find what you're looking for. The more specific you are with those questions, usually the better. And I found in my experience a lot of the time when people are just starting out with photography or with photo editing specifically, they don't even know what to look for or what to search for. And so I'm really hoping that I'll be able to give you some of the tools to basically also be able to help yourself more later on. So this is all, I mean, this is a never-ending journey. I'm still learning about photo editing, and I've been working on it for the past 15, 16, 17 years, something like that. And you'll never get to the end. It's, especially all of this software is massive. There's so many different possibilities, so many things you can do. You'll never get to the end. So just keep that in mind. To progress, you will need to practice. You'll need to continue learning. But I'm hoping to be able to give you folks a starting point. Hopefully that'll make things easier. Anyway, we were going to quickly ask everyone what they're using for software, but maybe we'll leave that for now, and I'll talk more about the vague stuff, and then we'll get into more specific later. We are doing this workshop over 2 nights, so I'll probably try to get through most of the theory type stuff tonight. And then next week, probably come back to do more of a hands-on where I will just take one piece of standardly used photo editing software and show you specifically what it looks like. Again, though, all of this software, all of the functions, everything is essentially the same. Everything works a little bit differently, but you know, the definitions are the same, and so on and so forth. There is a handout that I think you should have all received now in your emails. It does not follow along with the workshop. It is specifically for you to use afterwards, more or less. There are some definitions that should help you out. Some parts of the process. I'll try to go through that handout as well in a bit, but anyway, hopefully all of that stuff helps. And for now, we'll just jump into it. And anytime you have a question, just jump in and let me know. So I'm also just learning how to use this presentation software, so we will see if I can make it so that you guys can see what I'm doing. Okay, can everyone see that? Yes, okay, perfect. All right. So welcome. Thanks everyone for being here. So jumping right in. That's really unfortunate that there's a watermark on this and it's directly in front of it for me and I can't read the content. Got it. Okay. So the importance of photo editing. Photo editing essentially enhances your images in general. Typically when they come out of the camera, they're not quite finished. And a good comparison for those of us who remember is film photography. When you were done shooting your roll of film, it wasn't ready to present yet, right? You had to develop the film. And so photo editing is sort of a similar situation. And there's a lot that goes into this. We have different types of files, and some of them are more finished than others. But essentially, the editing aspect is taking control over what your final image looks like beyond what you see directly in the camera. So it allows you also to correct any flaws in the image. So this is also a bit of an interesting point. We're talking about art specifically right now, but when it comes to general photo editing, you know, there will be things that you'll have to fix and get rid of, things that distract from the image. And it may come up in your art, especially if you're doing installations, performance art, so on and so forth, where there's stuff that you just have to get rid of, correct, help emphasize. It really plays a critical role also in impacting how audiences perceive the content. So if we just take an offhand picture with our cell phone of our art installation versus something that has been thoughtfully photographed and edited, one is going to be a lot more impactful than the other, really. And so the point of editing is exactly that. And it is not necessarily to make things, in this sense at least, when we're just talking about photo editing, it's not necessarily to make things seem unreal or over the top. We're typically trying to keep things very natural. Cameras do not always automatically make your picture look exactly the way that you saw it. And so often we have to jump in with a piece of software and edit the photo so that it looks exactly the way we saw it, the way we remember it, the way it's meant to look. So a lot of it is very subtle. So that essentially one thing that I like to try to do with my images is often edit them in a way that you can't tell that they've been edited, but that they just look nicer. So different techniques, different things you may have heard are, and that are going to be relevant to us, especially in the world of art, are things like color correction, cropping, and then just adjusting the brightness and contrast, or highlights and shadows we'll talk a lot about. So how dark is the darkest spot, how bright is the brightest spot, so on and so forth. And another big thing is once we start getting into editing software, we also have to learn how to export our images for their intended use. And it's not just, you know, we've edited a picture and we now need to figure out how to set it up for the intended use. But sometimes in the world of, for example, applying for an art grant or for the permanent collection, you're going to have specifics about what size your picture is supposed to be. And I've found often people who don't have a lot of experience with that, they may be able to take a picture with their cell phone that looks great and works, but they'll often struggle with those little things that other people in the industry take for granted, like what file type, how to rename and resize, and what sizes and everything you actually need. So that's a shockingly important part of the editing process, is preparing or exporting your images for exactly what you need. So those are sort of really the basics, and editing goes on forever and ever and ever. And we'll talk about a couple more advanced techniques, but essentially that's the real bones of it, is like our color correction, our cropping, our brightness, and exporting the pictures. That's sort of the basic. We need to be able to do this. Luckily, almost every bit of software these days can do those basic functions. So where things get really wild is exactly that. It's software. So understanding the tools is essential for effective photo editing. And there's a huge range these days between your more classic desktop applications, like Photoshop, for example, where you can really do anything. The sky's the limit. The programs are so powerful that you can really do anything you want to a picture, down to mobile applications where you're just making real quick correction to be able to post something on Facebook. Maybe just a quick crop, or brightening a picture up just a little bit because the automatic exposure got it too dark or something. Anyway, so it's a huge range, but knowing what is best for you to use will really, really make things better for you in the end. So every piece of software, every tool essentially has its pros and cons, and based on what you're using, what camera you're using, what you need the pictures for, there's going to be different software that works best for you. So it's also really worth looking into that and figuring out what works best for you. And also figuring out your barriers. There are some pieces of software that cost money. Some of them are free. Some of them can do this and some of them can do that better. And it's going to come down to the individual and what your use is in the end. So popular photo editing software includes things like, as I've mentioned already, Adobe Photoshop, which is known for its functionality and really being able to do everything. Photoshop has been, at least my whole career and life, really the standard of photo editing. There are other programs and there are people who will swear by others and so on, but Photoshop and the Adobe suite is typically seen as one of the top tiers, and people understand it. So knowing how to use that software, if you have access to it, is really good, and it's going to be really helpful for you. There's also, from Adobe, there's also Lightroom. Those two, Photoshop and Lightroom, are sort of, they come together as a package typically, and those are more or less the photo specific bits of the Adobe suite. So there's also options to get this whole Adobe suite with a million different programs. For the most part, all you would ever need is those two. I just got completely off track. I didn't want to talk about that. So Lightroom specifically is what I would call sort of a developing software. So thinking about taking that roll of film and developing it to get negatives, and to be ready to enlarge the pictures. So essentially, when you take the photos out of your camera, you can imagine, especially if you're using raw files, which we'll talk about after, so just keep that in mind. If you're using raw files, what you have is an image that has not been touched by a computer. All it is really just code. And then you need to manipulate that, or you need to make decisions about that, how bright things should be, how dark they should be, what the color tones should be, so on and so forth. And programs like Lightroom are made specifically for that. And so I mentioned that specifically because there are essentially, like, although you can do everything in Photoshop these days, there's sort of two classes of software. And one of those is the sort of developing side, the raw developing and cataloging, where for something like that, you would have a program like Lightroom where you can do your basic edits, your color, your brightness, your contrast. You can also add keywords to photos. Sometimes applications ask for keywords. You can also rename, change the size, do all of that stuff. You can do, and you can batch edit, especially. That's the biggest thing. If you've taken a lot of pictures and you need, you want them all to be the same size, you can run the program to export 100 pictures at the same time, all in the proper size, all in the same size. Whereas a program like Photoshop is more powerful, but it's what I would call a retouching software. It's more powerful, and it's meant specifically for one individual image at a time. It's not to say you can't do more, but that's basically what it's made for. So typically these days, that type of developing software is what you're going to need the most. And a really high power retouching software, you're really only going to need in specific situations. Yeah, there's a bunch of other notable softwares that are worth mentioning. There's a program called GIMP it's in my handout, but it's worth knowing about for anyone who would like to get into that realm of being able to manipulate and change their images. It's a retouching software like Photoshop, but it's completely open source, and it's free. The biggest issue I find is that it's not super user friendly. And if you've ever thought that other things like Adobe programs aren't user friendly, if you've ever played around with editing software and thought it was difficult, GIMP takes a lot more time, and you would really have to work your way into it. But for that, it's completely free. So that's great. And then there's something called Capture One, which I'll probably do some demonstrations later on Capture One. It's a pretty powerful program that's become the standard, more or less the standard, across commercial photography realms. Because you can specifically, and anyone who's done any of the in-person workshops has seen this with me, you can plug your camera directly into your computer and take the photos directly into that program. And so you can be editing them and working on them and looking at them on the computer screen as you go. Anyway, that being said, that's also a professional level software and has a professional level price. So also worth thinking about. Then there's a whole crazy world of mobile editing apps. It is so vast that we're just gonna barely touch on it. But essentially, so there's apps like Snapseed is a free app that you can do most of your basic edits in, similar to most of your Lightroom stuff. Then Adobe has a Lightroom mobile that's quite robust and works quite well. It also syncs with your other Adobe accounts if you're paying for Adobe and using the desktop version. So you can pretty seamlessly work back and forth between systems. However, to be able to do that, it does cost a bit of money. And or, as a lot of companies do, there's free versions, but for that, you end up not having access to all of the tools and all of the functions. But that's okay. It's an option as well. And one thing, because we talk a lot in these workshops about taking pictures with your smartphones. So pretty much all of the modern smartphones have a pretty decent editing software built right into their camera apps. I personally have an iPhone, and on top of that, I don't do a lot of editing on my smartphone. So I can't really get super deeply into the specifics, but we've looked at this before in person, and there's typically, when you take a picture, your Photos app or something will have a function that says edit. And when you click on that, you can at least do basic things like crop the photo, change the aspect ratio, so how long the sides are in relation to each other, and usually do some brightness and some color. And a lot of the time, if you're taking the time and taking your picture thoughtfully, going through the processes and really working hard on getting your picture taken correctly in the camera, then a lot of the time that's more or less all you're going to need for these things is, to be able to crop down right to the edges of a painting that you just took a picture of, or maybe brighten something up a little bit. So it's also worth looking at those native editing apps. And the best part about them is that they're all free. They're built in, and they've got most of the software you need. I should also mention that Windows and Apple both have on desktop software that does the same basics. So if you are using Apple, it's in Photos. There's actually a shockingly strong editing suite in there. And then on Windows, I think it's called Windows 10 Photo or something along those lines. I actually have it written down somewhere though, so we'll see that exactly. But both of those, they exist for desktops and for smartphones. And like as I said, the best thing is they're free and they come pre-installed. So if all else fails, you've at least got that right away that you can work with. So choosing the right tool. Yeah, as I already said, the choice of your software really depends on what you need and how complex it's going to be, and then your hardware. So for someone who's just starting, to get basically just to up your game a little bit from having just taken a picture on your smartphone to, okay, now I'm going to control this a little bit, you're probably going to be happy to start playing around with things like Apple Photos or the Windows version of it. However, that might not quite be enough for all of the things you need to do. And another thing to think about, though, aside from that, is if you're using a smartphone, for example. So if you're using a camera, you're always going to have to worry about how do I get physically point A to point B? How do I get my pictures off my camera onto my computer to edit them? So that can sometimes be quite annoying with cell phones. And if you don't need a lot of heavy lifting done with your pictures, if you really are just like renaming, cropping, changing the brightness and contrast a little bit, then it might be the easiest for you if you're taking pictures on your smartphone to edit them directly on your smartphone, because then you also don't have to be pushing all of these files around. Anyway, it's just things that you should be thinking about when you're talking about getting into editing is like, and you're looking at software, is not necessarily going out and just buying the thing that everyone talks about, but actually looking at your specific needs and if that piece of software will be the right one for you. I've said that a whole bunch of times now already, but it is really important and it can save you a lot of trouble. I found, especially when I started doing photography, there was many or much less options in terms of editing software, but it didn't really matter because everyone basically said you have to have Adobe. You have to have the Adobe Creative Suite, Adobe Photoshop, and so on and so forth to be able to edit photos. And there was never anyone really talking about like, is that actually what I need? It was just this is the standard, use it. So I really think before going down any rabbit holes and buying expensive things, it's always worth looking at exactly what your needs are, and you can always upgrade later. So moving on, because I've talked about software for quite some time now. Basic editing techniques. So understanding how to manipulate essential aspects of your images is crucial. So the basic techniques that I already mentioned before, like cropping, adjusting brightness, correcting colors, sharpening your images, they are really the foundation of forming, enhancing your picture, getting to a finished product. So we'll start with cropping and resizing, I guess, because that's a pretty important bit. So if you can see this on the screen, there's a little picture here. This is on a piece of software, the cropping square, what it looks like when you start to crop. And what you're doing when you're cropping is you're changing what is actually on the picture. The analog version of this would be taking a piece of paper with a picture on it and scissors and cutting it out. And so you're removing the unwanted parts of an image. And let's say that could be used as a design element, or, you took a family picture and there's some person standing in the background and you just want to crop them out so that you don't see them in your family picture. Or when it comes to art, which we're talking about, it's really crucial, especially when you're talking about two-dimensional pictures with paintings and so on and so forth. There's that decision to be made about how you want to present it, but typically you're going to want the whole image to be your painting. Or, for example, if you're going to be reproducing your pieces of work in print, then obviously you're going to want it to be only your painting on it, right? And so that's why we start here. So this picture on the screen we took in the in-person workshop for this, and it's just on a white background to make it easier to photograph and easier to crop. And so the first thing we're going to do is go and crop into the edges of that picture so we only have the picture in front of us. One of the most important things to think about when you're doing this is, I think if you look at it, you can see on the left, viewer's left side of the picture, or I guess on the right as well, this is a collage and it's not perfectly straight. However, when you're cropping, you're only doing straight lines. I mean, we see like that's how photos are presented, right? So that means if you're trying to crop down on this picture, you have to make a choice of either leaving a bit of a border of the background or chopping off some of the picture. And so that's worth thinking about also when you're taking the picture, is how you're going to do this. Are you going to have to cut down? So if I were to crop this right to the edges, the picture that's there, then on the left, we would lose a strip of that. Now, I'm not entirely sure if that would be an issue, and that would be for the artist to decide. But it's possible that they want to show that this is all cut out by hand, in which case you would have to go on the background version. Anyway, moving on. So resizing your images adjusts the dimensions. I think I'm probably, oh no, I'm not getting too far ahead of myself. Never mind. Resizing your images. Basically, as you can also see in this picture, there are some numbers with a px beside them. There's 1024px and 768px. I'm not sure if you can recognize that, but that's the amount of pixels. And essentially, that's what I have that crop set to. And it's going to have the image in the end is going to turn out that size, which means there's enough digital information for this picture to be so big. And what happens is we want to strike that perfect balance. And a lot of programs, for example, I was just speaking with Garnet about the permanent archive submissions. So when you're doing a submission, they'll typically want your image to be a certain size. And the reason for that is if you go too small on the one end, when they look at it on a screen or however they're looking at it, they're not going to be able to see enough detail. And if they zoom all the way in, it's like taking a picture that's on a piece of elastic and stretching it. So if you zoom in too far on a picture where the dimensions, the pixels are too low, then it's just going to get, well, pixelated, where you essentially stretch it so far that you can start seeing the individual pixels. So you start seeing these little squares of color instead of seeing your clear picture. And then on the other side, you might say, well, why would I want to reduce the dimensions of my image at all anyway, if that's just going to make it worse? But sometimes, especially with more modern cameras, the images that are coming out of the camera are typically way, way, way bigger than we need, and often way bigger than you can, for example, send in an email. So then you start having problems with that. And so, for example, with the permanent collection, we decided or spoke about it, and the decision was that essentially they want the images to be coming in small enough that artists can put multiple pictures in one email to send to the jury for consideration without running into issues with the email just being too big to send, which happens all the time. Anyway, so those are the considerations. So it's really important to know what we're doing, how to resize things, and what the deciding factors are, because that's going to, on the one hand, affect the quality of our image, or on the other hand, affect the size of our image. And so we want to be able to strike that balance. And then there's also, unfortunately, just to make things a little bit more complicated, there is a difference between web and print uses and how you decide on the sizes and so on and so forth. However, typically, if you're submitting an application, they will tell you what size they need the pictures to be for best usage. But yeah, it's also worth knowing. So if you set up a picture to be viewed perfectly on a screen and then go and print it, you might be shocked with how small the print comes out. And so it's just things to consider. Okay, so does anyone who's in here have any questions right now? I tend to go way too quickly without thinking about it. I'll just give you a couple seconds. Nobody's saying anything, so we'll just move on. Oh,
sorry. I don't know when. I guess I just want to ask if we're going to cover this, but one of my main interests is like in making prints, and but I've kind of encountered, like, I don't know, I'll take things into a print shop, get it scanned, and I don't know if, like, to kind of have it scanned, like scan that done, and if they do get that image back and adjust the colors and then send it back to get it printed. Does that make sense?
You cut out a little bit, but I think what you were saying is you would typically take your image into a print shop and they would scan it.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out, like, what most people do when they want to make prints of their artwork.
Oh, okay.
And, like, if you, like, I don't have
so I don't think I have that specific thing covered, so I can answer you right away. Sorry if I understood you correctly.
Okay.
Anyway, so about what, like, most people would do, because I've talked a lot about this as well. If you have images that can be scanned, it's often the best way, as opposed to taking a picture of them with a camera. Scanners are usually super high resolution. You get a high quality. The workflow is really going to depend on you yourself. So I typically wouldn't take a picture to be scanned because I have a scanner. But if I were to do so, let's say I needed a bigger scanner than I had, or a higher quality resolution than the one I have, then I personally would ask them to scan it and give it to me as sort of the most basic copy. Like, every scanner seems to have built-in automatic color correction. And personally, if I were scanning an image, I would turn all of that off and I would build it from the ground up in Photoshop, for example, or in an editing program afterwards. So when I have in the past had to go to a shop to scan, there are different things. It was more common with me when I was using negatives to get a really high image, really high quality of the negative. But I would then go and pick it up and take it home and do the editing myself, because I'm quite adept with editing and I know what I want the final result to look like. Whereas if you don't know how to do the editing, it may be better to have them do that process, and then they could just, like, if you're getting it scanned to be printed, then there's nothing wrong with having the shop do that all for you, as long as you're comfortable with the result. So people do it both ways. The thing is that you are losing control of your image, but on the other hand, I think it would also really depend on where you're taking it and who's doing it. Like, if you were able to take your image and say, I would like this reproduced 1-to-1, and they're able to scan it, color correct it, and print it for you, and it looks, and you can hold up the original and the print, and it sort of passes your own quality test, I guess, but it looks the exact same, then you don't necessarily need to be taking that file back and doing it yourself, right?
Okay.
I feel like I'm not answering you.
No, actually, that's very helpful. I guess well, another whole other conversation would maybe be just, like, the quality of scanner that you need in order to, like, that would be comparable to, like, a print shop. Like, I'm assuming as a photographer, you probably have a pretty good quality scanner. I don't know.
Honestly I think my scanner cost like $200 something. It's not like a crazy. Pardon me?
That seems reasonable.
Yeah, no, it's not like, and it's not the highest end, right? Like, if I was opening a print shop, I would have a higher end scanner probably, but for everything I've ever needed to use it for, it has been perfectly fine. Okay. So I think that's a whole different world in a way, but it's something worth looking into because you can actually get one that will probably take care of your needs. I mean, are we talking about printing things in, 4 meters by 5 meters or something, or talking about making art prints, like reproductions to sell to people?
Yeah, just small reproductions, like.
Then you're probably, especially, so the way that this works, and I think this is quite important probably for folks to know, maybe not, maybe this is very niche, but if your original is going to be smaller like if the print is going to be smaller than your original, then you have so much more playroom when it comes to the quality, because in the end, the smaller your output's going to be, essentially the higher, like, it gets difficult to make things bigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because then we're talking about how much information is in there and how far can I stretch it. So if you can scan something 1-to-1 on a scanner, a flatbed scanner, and then you're going to print it out smaller, you're barely going to have to think about quality of image, at least. Then really the biggest thing for you is going to be the color correction aspect.
Yeah, so that's what I really want to know about is color.
Yeah, so if you look at an editing software, and I think most phones do this too, you take a picture and you go into edit and do the color, and it gives you like an auto option. Often the automatic option looks like a magic wand with some like little stars coming off the end or something. And if you see that automatic option and you hit that button and you don't like that result, that's sort of what we're talking about, right? That's just the computer deciding what it should look like. And for the most part, if you were going to scan something, unless you're paying a service to actually do the color correction for you, if you're just doing a basic scan, it's typically scanners have this auto function on, and you lose the control, right? So it might turn out looking perfect, but there's a very good chance it won't. Does that help?
Yeah. And I use Photoshop, and I do have some experience with it. Like I did the course that John Jelena teaches at the college a few years back. So I can, like you said, I can find my way using the internet if I come into trouble spots. But I always find color, like adjustment, kind of one of the more challenging things for me. But anyway.
So the unfortunate part about color is that you can also do university courses just on color theory. It is and I'm sure with your art, you probably have looked a lot into color, but it is a very, very big topic. But essentially what you're going to be talking about is really the most, and this is going to be important for everyone, where this is an important topic, is white balance. It's how the computer, whether the computer is in your camera or the computer is your computer, it's how the computer calculates what white is and thus what all other colors are. Because as we know, ambient light or whatever light is around us has a color, right? And so if you look at a picture outside under the sun or in a room under a very warm, comfortable yellow light in your living room, they're going to look completely different, right? And so that's going to be one of the biggest things. So setting the white balance is telling essentially your computer what white should look like based on the light that it was photographed in. And that is something that you do have to do in editing software. And the more you know your way around that, the better off you're going to be and the better you're going to be able to edit those colors. And we've talked about this in other workshops. I do recommend for anyone who's photographing art, for anyone who's photographing anything that needs to be quite true to color, where you don't have that creative control, you need it to be the way it looks, it is worth investing in what's called a gray card. And a gray card, they come in all these different formats. Some of them are super fancy and come with software and it does it all for you. And some of them are literally a piece of gray card that you put it in your frame when you're taking your picture. And then when you go into Photoshop, Lightroom, whatever program you're using, you click on that gray and you tell the computer, this is this gray. And the computer goes, oh, if that's what that color looks like, then I know what all the other colors are. Right?
Okay.
And so even in Photoshop and Lightroom, typically you'll have somewhere, I'm not sure that Photoshop directly does it, but there is a way to do it in Photoshop. But Lightroom and essentially all of the development software. So I was talking before about developing software versus retouching software. So definitely all of the developing software can do this, because one of the main purposes of that software is to set your colors. And so, as I said, this does exist in Photoshop. It's a program called Camera Raw that is built in, but just for time's sake, we'll talk about, let's say, Lightroom. And so you'll have a little eyedropper somewhere. It'll say white balance, and you'll have a little eyedropper. Wait, can I? And I think we're going to get into this, but there you go. So if you see this on the screen, these bars, can you see my mouse moving, just so I know for pointing purposes?
Yeah.
Okay. So up here, this is from the software I use, which is called Capture One, but this is the white balance, right? So if you went to, these are the different things I talked about. If you can see that, I talked about the auto thing. And so here's a little magic wand with some little dots shooting off of it. If you click on that, the program does it for you. Always worth trying. It definitely works better than if you let your cell phone do it for you, for example. But then you have this little eyedropper here. And if you click on that eyedropper, it'll give you, like, turn your cursor into an eyedropper, and then you go and click on the gray from your gray card that you used, and that will change all of the colors. And when we actually get into doing this, either later on tonight or next week, by the looks of things, I'll show the white balance thing in more detail. And then I'll show some other color corrections. But that's one of the best ways to start your base to get your accurate colors, right? Because then at least the computer, the software, knows what color that light in the room was, right? Because white has a color. We know what white is. We just don't often actually see it. But our eyes are so good at correcting colors that no matter what light, like I'm sitting in very warm light right now. Well, I mean, you can tell if you look behind me, my walls in this room are actually white. But because of the color cast coming off of the lights, they look very yellow in the monitor on the computer. If I look at my walls right now in person, I can see that they're white because my eyes can automatically adjust to that. So what we're doing is helping the computer adjust to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then we do
Absolutely.
color, which I hope some people know this. Color we talk about in temperature, in Kelvin. And so that's really, when you see this blue and this yellow slider here, that is literally setting the Kelvin, is it degrees Kelvin? I believe so, of the light in the picture. So we will also talk in editing and photography about color temperature. But that's that. Yeah. So I hope that helped a little bit. Feel free to let me know.
Yeah,
if it
sorry to sidetrack. I hope that helped other people too.
No, it's not much of a sidetrack. It's just like, as I said, I'm not great at these linear things anyway. I try to have a presentation so that I don't get too lost and I remember all the points. But this is a super important bit that we need to talk about anyway. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I just have one tiny question. So the gray,
Go for it.
What did you call it? The gray.
It's
the gray card. Where do
yeah.
you get those?
Any photography store, any Amazon, they're usually like, if you get the one that's just a card, they're usually like $10 or something, or you can get the fancy version for like $200. But in its defense, the fancy version comes with software that you also have to learn how to use, and you also need Lightroom, Photoshop, etc. to use it. But I use that when I'm doing art reproduction, because then, as I said, like, not only is every light a little bit different, and every viewing scenario changes how we see color. And keeping in mind, like, I'm not going to screw around with moving my camera, but I'm sitting right beside a really big window right now as well. And so the color in that part of the room is super mixed. My eyes see it as normal. But anyway, I digress. So all of these things are different, and they're affecting how we view something. And so then on top of that, to make it even more complicated, there's there's your screen that you're looking at the picture on after you've taken it. So your computer screen is probably not going to be perfectly calibrated to color, which means it's going to look normal to you. But anyone who's gone tried to change any settings on their TV, computer, whatever, knows that there's often like these different modes, and like computers these days will also change the mode based on if they think what they think looks best for movies, for example, right? So if you're in the wrong mode, if you've set the brightness on your computer wrong, you're going to see that picture. It's going to look perfect. But especially if you're printing it, when you print it, everything might be off, right? And so to circumvent all of that stuff, these it's called the Color Checker Passport, I believe, or Color Checker Pro, something like that. And it's a little plastic card that has a gray card in it and also has a full color scale in it. And what I can do with that is I run it through its own software, and then it gives me a color profile, which essentially says to my editing software, to Lightroom, under these lighting conditions, if we use this color profile, this color should look exactly like this. So it's getting a bit in the weeds, but basically what I do is run that through, and then I can just trust that the colors are accurately represented, regardless of what it actually looks like on the screen I'm using.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a bit insane, and it's a bit weird, and you're trusting software and technology at a pretty high level, but it works quite well. Anyway, that was me getting way off track talking about color tools. But yes, a basic gray card. You can, if you look for like white balance card or something, you'll find it. The function is called white balance. It's a gray card that you use to use it, and the color specifically is an 18% neutral gray. So those are the things that are important for you to know in that regard. And next time I see you, if I have one, I'd be happy to show you or we can organize if you want to get more deeper into that. I can show you this stuff.
Nice, thank you.
Okay, so moving on from that, is everyone else with me? I know all the cameras are off, but someone just make a noise if you're not. Also, if anyone has any questions, then feel free to jump in, or we'll just move on.
Happy for you to move on.
Yeah.
All right, let's go. Sorry, it's so easy to get really nerdy about color stuff, Michelle. I apologize. So
it's okay. I have all night.
So adjusting brightness and contrast. Brightness adjustments enhance how, as it sounds, it's pretty obvious how light or dark our image appears, which can obviously also change the mood of the image, or can give us a more or less accurate representation of what this piece of art looks like. The contrast adjustments the contrast is the difference between the dark and the light areas. I realize contrast has further meanings than that, but we're only really talking about dark and light when we're talking about editing. So it can add a bit of depth or dimension into the image, but it can also flatten an image out if you go the wrong direction, take contrast out, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's a pretty simple concept, I believe. So really quickly, I don't think we need to talk too much about color correction at this particular moment because we just went down that rabbit hole. But color correction rectifies inaccurate colors to ensure realism or artistic intent, meaning when we're not doing, reproductions of paintings, if we don't need the colors to be exactly perfect, we can also use the color adjustments or the color correction to give an overall feeling or vibe to the image. So think about how movies, they talk about color grading in movies when you basically you start with a very flat image and you add the color in the way that you want it to affect emotion, to decide how people feel when they're looking at it, really. Yeah, that's all that we need about that right now. Okay, so sharpening and noise reduction, just for anyone, because I feel a bit lost, anyone who may have gotten lost, I'm basically these are all functions in all of the editing software, if I didn't mention that before. So these are basic techniques that will show up in pretty much all editing software. So it's worth knowing what those things mean and what they do. So sharpening clarifies the details in an image. And It enhances the definition and makes specific subjects more prominent. You can also do selective sharpening, where you only sharpen, for example, someone's face and not the background. This is not a replacement for taking a sharp picture. It can, if you've got a little bit of blur, tiny bit out of focus, it can make it feel a little bit more in focus, but really this is a little bit of a different thing, and you still want your picture to be sharp in your camera. Those are not the exact same thing. Like, you can't make an out of focus picture more focused when you're editing. It just doesn't work that way. So noise, I talk about noise a lot. I'm not sure if people know about noise in images, but essentially noise is the graininess. I love my comparisons to analog photography, and the best way to talk about it is the different ISOs of different films. You would use a higher ISO for nighttime or dark images, but it introduces an extra grain into the picture, or extra noise into the picture. So if you can see, I tried to over embellish this so that you can sort of see it on the screen, but in this picture that's on the screen, that gray bit, for example, looks like TV static. That's the noise, right? Anyway, so noise reduction is a tool that most editing software has. It minimizes the graininess that comes along with low light photos, and can result in cleaner. I should have written that instead. Can result in cleaner and smoother images. You can also very quickly, because this is also an artificial thing similar to the sharpening, you can also, if you have a very noisy picture, you can quickly make it look fake and plastic, I guess, by reducing the noise too much, because then it's artificially sort of getting rid of that, smoothing everything out. So especially, yeah, it's something to be especially careful with when you're using noise reduction, that you are very subtle about it. Otherwise, it can go wrong very fast and just look like you took, I don't know, an eraser over someone's face. Like, you'll just get rid of all the details. That is essentially how that function works, is it gets rid of specific details. So worth playing with, looking at. It's very easy to overdo it, especially when you're learning, but that's actually, unfortunately, a fact with almost all things in editing, is that when you're learning how to do it, there's a good chance you will overdo it in the beginning, but eventually you get there. So just to very quickly touch on some more advanced editing techniques, we won't really get much into them, because most of them don't have much place when it comes to art photography, for example, but it is worth talking about. So advanced techniques can really elevate your photos beyond the basic adjustments, and these would sort of be the things you would use also to manipulate photos completely, to do compositions when you're doing essentially like a Photoshop collage type of thing, when you're putting together a picture out of nothing. Anyway, so the tools, the specific tools, are things like layering, masking, and different filters, which are a whole different topic. But wait, let me just see if I get right into this. I do get right into it. So we'll just move on there. So layering allows for multiple image components to be combined, enabling adjustments without affecting the original image, which means if you've ever used Photoshop before, or a lot of similar programs, you're basically putting these, like, you can think of it like those overhead projector, what are they called? The like plastic, the sheets, the transparent plastic overhead projector sheets, where you can, you have your piece of paper and then you draw something on the clear sheet and you put it on top, and then it sort of merges it, but it doesn't affect your initial image. So that's how layers work in Photoshop. It's pretty much the exact same thing. And it's kind of fantastic, because what that means is you can make changes to one specific thing that are always undoable. They're not permanent, because you're not actually making those changes on the picture, which is super valuable if you have to make large changes. And that's how I think all editing should be done, if you have the capacity to use layers, it's super important because you're basically keeping your images safe at that point in time, if that makes any sense. Anyway, so masking is a technique that also uses layers, and it's to selectively hide or reveal parts of the layer, which means, and so this is a bit more valuable for art photography. I guess you have to understand layers for it, but essentially, if you see in this little picture, there's some red on the picture. Everything that is red, painted red, is a mask. And essentially, you take a paintbrush in your software program, and I think even a lot of cell phone apps have this, and you paint over a specific area, and then you can make changes just to that specific area, for example. And again, those changes are not permanent because they're effectively on a different layer. And so that's also how we combine multiple images, would be putting them together in the layers and then essentially hiding through your mask, hiding parts of it that you don't actually want to be seen to allow the parts that are below that layer to show through. So really quickly, because people get into this, this is a kind of a problem. So filters and presets, almost every editing app, every software, especially cell phone apps, especially cell phone apps, will have filters and presets. Filters apply specific effects to images. They alter essentially the idea is to alter the overall aesthetic, whereas presets save your preferred settings. So just a quick reference, that picture in this slide is, this cow is, right now I had just edited that with a preset, or sorry, with a filter to show what it looks like. And along the side here on the left side are all the different names of the filters from that program. And I didn't actually want to zoom in. I just forgot how this thing works. That's fine. But I personally don't love the look of that image, but I just wanted to show like that's the overall aesthetic piece. Anyway, so presets I find can be much more helpful if you're always taking pictures sort of in the same lighting and you have the same basic edits that are going to be done to them. So the same white balance, for example, or the same brightness, contrast, something like that. You can make a preset, which you take your preferred settings, and then you can just sort of copy and paste that onto all of your other pictures. And usually it'll be saved in your program. So even if I'm editing on a different day, or if I'm editing in a completely different situation, I can take that preset, and when I click on that, all of those settings that I used, that I liked so much, will just automatically be applied. So really it's just about streamlining your workflow and maintaining a cohesive style across multiple photos. It can be really helpful even as a starting point. So regardless of how, like, these are all marketed, especially filters. People like to make filters and presets and then sell them because you can download them and just install them in programs. And so people like to make money doing that. And they show you all of these beautiful pictures that look so beautiful with these presets, and it makes it seem like a really easy starting place. The issue that I have with this is that I don't personally feel these techniques are super suitable for beginners, because every single time, as I mentioned, this filter that I used on this cow, I don't think it looks good. I could make this filter look good by going back into it. So now you've got a starting point and you make minor adjustments to suit it specifically to that picture. And it's the same thing with a preset. I mentioned like saving the white balance that you like, but sometimes maybe the sun moved a little bit on that day and the light or the color is a little bit different. So you have to know how to adjust those things as well. You can't just put a filter or a preset on something and say, okay, I'm done. And that's where I think that they're dangerous for beginners, because if you don't know what they're changing, you don't know how to make the adjustments. So it's just worth taking them sort of with a grain of salt. But you will see in every single program that they have these things set in. And I guess the best example would be anyone who's, taken a picture directly with Instagram and it just, or even uploaded, I guess, to Instagram, and it just gives you this whole list of filters that you can apply to a picture. And you click through and see what one looks best. But yeah, essentially they make that amount of heavy editing super accessible, but without knowing what you're doing, that can be a problem. So then the heaviest, probably the most advanced, or at least I would say quite possibly the most advanced technique in photo editing would be retouching. So retouching focuses on correcting imperfections, enhancing details, improving the overall image quality. And then restoration, which I don't know exactly why I have these together, as I don't know if we really need to talk much about restoration. It's reviving old and damaged photos, using essentially advanced retouching techniques and coloring techniques and so on and so forth. Retouching is a whole world, and for the most part, photographing your art, you don't need much of it. Probably the most common things that I would retouch when I'm taking pictures of art for reproduction would actually just be because I don't want to manipulate the image. I don't want to change it, right? I want it to be the exact same as I see it. But, you know, sometimes something happens and you get a hair or dust or something on your picture. And instead of going back and getting rid of it, you can just retouch it away in your software. There's some pretty intuitive, easy software that goes along, or retouching stuff functions that go along with some of the like mobile software as well, where you literally just tap your finger on the thing and you can drag it along and sort of trace along, and anything that was underneath that path of your finger will just get disappeared and blended into the actual picture. Okay, so we're still going. I'm just going to trust that people are going to jump in if they need something. So I'm not going to stop unless you tell me to. Tips for effective editing. And we're pretty much at the end of these slides anyway. But effective photo editing enhances your images while preserving their essence. Understanding key principles can elevate your editing skills, providing unique results at the highest level, which I think we all know by now. So what I had mentioned in the beginning, understanding your resolutions and file formats is super, super important. And also, I think, as you're probably realizing, a lot of these things are sort of rabbit hole topics where you can just learn and learn and learn and learn. But essentially, like this is really important when it comes to producing or preparing your final result. So understanding, or your resolution defines the detail the image holds, like we talked about before, so it can influence its clarity, or how pixelated it is, and so on and so forth. So that's exactly what we talked about with like how many pixels on one side versus the other side, and or if we're talking about print, you know, you can set something up to be the size for 5x7, which is also your computer just telling it how many pixels it needs essentially. But that's pretty much your resolution, and that along with DPI or PPI, most people have heard the terms, which are dots per inch and pixels per inch. And unfortunately, they're used quite interchangeably, but they do actually mean different things. But anyway, the amount of pixels per inch of your photo that you have, essentially, when you're like, the more information you have in each little box, right? Or I guess the most important is for print, it's the dots per inch, and that's literally how many dots of ink the printer is putting in that specific spot. And so the higher that number is, typically, you know, the more information we have in there. So also really important for this stuff, for exporting, you need to know what file format you want to be using, and it's worth, you know, a quick internet search about finding out about what some of these formats are and what they mean. But the most common one for photography is JPEG, and JPEGs are pretty much, it's across the board, across the world. Almost every bit of software, probably every bit of software, can open them. It's your standard digital picture. And so these days, there used to be different standards for printing, but for these days, for the most part, a large JPEG file will also work perfectly fine to take to the printer. It's also what you would put on Facebook or on your website. PNG is a whole different world, but essentially the most important thing, those are smaller file types, even smaller, but they have less color information, so they have lower quality. But those are great if you're making a logo and you don't want there to be a background, for example, things like that. PNG files can have transparent aspects to them, but they are only good then in the digital realm. Like they're not printing files. And TIFF is a international across all software, that I guess all imaging software at least. It can be read by everything, and it is pretty much the highest quality of these specific ones we're talking about. Those, yeah, you're going to have the biggest files, but you're also going to be able to edit them, work them a bit more. There's going to be more information and detail in them. So familiarizing yourself with these is really, really essential, because it's going to be necessary when you figure out what exactly you're doing with your pictures. I was just trying to think, I haven't really talked too much about it, but I've spoken before about raw images, and raw photos are not, nowadays it's getting better. A lot more programs can read raw images from specific cameras, but typically a raw image needs to be developed and turned into something before it can be used. So when you take a raw image with your camera, when you set your camera to its raw mode, you get the most information, you get the most editing capability, but you have to do all of that stuff yourself before you can pass the image along to anyone else. Whereas if you set your camera to JPEG, your picture is immediately ready to go, but you can't really edit it very much at all. Most of the information is already baked in there, and there's not much you can change. So I'm thinking we'll talk more about raw files later if I don't get to it in presentation mode, but I think we'll probably start out all of our practical stuff talking about raw images and the pros and cons. So I believe our last little tidbit or tip is really don't overdo it. It can be so much fun to learn how to edit, but overusing your editing techniques can very quickly ruin your image. And I tried really hard with this. I didn't, it was about 3 seconds, but this picture in this image, I just, cranked up the contrast and the saturation and really tried to show what an overdone image would look like. But yeah, as I have written here, this rule about not overdoing it especially applies to color, contrast, and saturation. So those are the things I've changed the most in that picture. Overdoing it will really just make it look like you don't know what you're doing, and often it'll lead you to just having to start again if you go too far, and you'll realize it later and you'll have to start over again completely. So one of the things that I see the most often, and I was also guilty of myself for sure, is when people learn how to edit. I think my theory is that everyone is looking for that quick fix. Editing is about subtlety. As I mentioned way earlier, we want the pictures to look natural. We don't necessarily want them to look edited. We just want them cleaned up, right? And so it's really about that subtlety. But when you're learning that, it can be really hard because we're often searching for instant gratification. So you want to see the things that make your picture pop right away. And so not knowing better, the most common thing is that people crank up the contrast and they crank up the saturation, which is exactly what happened in that picture on the screen. And then it no longer looks natural at all. And I see that a lot of the time with beginners to editing, that they start posting their pictures on Facebook or on social media, and you can see very clearly that they were so excited about being able to see their edit that they've gone way too far. So a couple good rules of thumb. Excuse me. A couple good rules of thumb when you're starting to edit is that if you're making changes in like color and contrast in a picture, sometimes you just need to walk away from it and do something else and open it up again. Because often when we get so deeply ingrained in that process and we're making relatively small adjustments and then we go and go and go and go, then we look back at it and realize, oh, I've done way too much. But in that moment, you're automatically adjusting to the new look of it. So you're not seeing it as it's happening. So it's always worth going back and looking at, even 10 minutes later, just walking away from your computer screen or going to answering some emails or something and coming back with more or less fresh eyes and saying, what does this look like now? Also, the before and after button in whatever software you're using is super, super critical. And I probably do that with almost every individual photo that I'm editing, that I do the edit and then I quickly give a before and after look. And sometimes you've really gone too far and you'll do the before and after and you'll realize that the before, the straight out of camera picture with nothing done to it, looks better because you've really pushed it too far with your editing. And so that's a good sign to sort of tone it down. Another rule of thumb that I've heard for some of these tools, especially when you're using layers and stuff, is that sometimes you do your edit and then you go and you take down, so you can change the opacity on layers, how much you can actually see them, how strong they are. And so often you'll do your edit and you'll just turn it down by, 20%. Because to sort of compensate for that, you're probably going to go a little bit too hard. And then you can just dial it back a little tiny bit afterwards. And you'll come to a more natural spot. Anyway, this is super key that you don't overdo the edits. Which actually, these two things go super hand in hand. Never edit your original. So luckily, most pieces of developing software don't change the originals, especially if you're using raw files. You actually can never change the original. You just add a little file onto it. So you can always go back to the original. So when I say never edit the original, I also don't necessarily mean like if you're taking raw photos, which are large, you don't need to save them all multiple times in case you mess up, because with raw, it's what we say is completely non-destructive. So you're not actually changing anything permanently in the image. All you're doing is adding essentially like a filter or something. You're essentially adding like an extra bit on top of information on top of that to make it look like you've changed it. So it's really, really, really important that you're either, if you're working with JPEG images or something that is not raw, that you do have copies. And you will learn this very, very quickly when you start spending a lot of time editing, because it happens to everyone that you will mess up. That you'll mess up and you'll have to start again, but you'll realize that you've used your original and you have just ruined your picture and there's no saving it anymore. It's unfortunate. It doesn't happen often. Usually it only takes a couple times before you never do it again. I wrote something completely different here, so I'm just quickly scanning through to see if I touched on all of that stuff. I think I more or less did. Yeah, so when we're talking about this, also goes into the whole import-export aspect of specific editing software, especially desktop editing software. Anything that has where you have to export, basically what's happening is you have your raw image and you get a little hitchhiker type of file every time you make an edit, which it's actually, if you open these files, it's all just text. And all of these edits that you make are written into this extra file, and it's connected to your original image in the source file. You don't have to do anything for this. It's just there. And then what happens when you export it is, and this is the reason why you can't really, like, you can't really just send your raw picture to someone. You have to export it, because then it takes your file, it takes a copy of your file, it takes the edits that you made, it cooks them together, and it spits it out in the file format that you want, whilst all the while leaving your original file untouched. So then you can have tons of different copies, different edits of the same picture, but your original is always there. And one other real small tidbit to go along with that, because I've talked about saving and exporting and stuff like that, and different file formats. This is something that's just been niggling at the back of my head, so I think I should mention it. If we're talking about JPEG images, they lose quality the more times they get saved. So what you don't want to be constantly opening them, making a minor change and resaving them, because every time you save them, they actually lose quality. When I was in school, we did an experiment where we took just a JPEG image and we just resaved it the exact same everything 100 times or something, and then had a copy of it and compared the original to the one that had been saved 100 times, and the image quality was extremely noticeable, the losses. And so when you're talking about those, like if you're working with a raw image, it doesn't matter how many times you change things, but if you're working with a JPEG, every time you save it, you lose quality. So you typically your ideal workflow is going to be that you photograph things in that raw file format, and then you essentially save it to a JPEG, and then you deliver that JPEG to where it's going. You don't just keep opening it, looking at it, closing it, saving it, all that stuff over and over again. That seems probably like it's very in the weeds for where we're at right now, but you know, if that sticks somewhere in the back of your head, then it's worthwhile. And as always, one of the key bits to any of this, also to taking pictures, is to keep learning more, stay inspired, have fun with it. You're not going to get there tomorrow, and you're not going to get there the next day. This is a huge process. It takes a lot of time, and the more fun you can have with it, the more you practice it, the more you are willing to learn about it, the better off you're going to be, and the better you're going to be at it. So just stick to it and try to have fun. So that concludes my slides. I'm going to come back to the camera if I can figure out how. And I would love to ask if anyone at this point has any questions, because I've now been talking straight at you for an hour and a half.
I have a question.
I could personally use a moment to stop talking.
Kind of touching on what you just said about every time you save an image, you lose a bit of the quality.
Yeah.
I've been wondering about images and what happens to them when you edit them. Like, say I start out with having a good size image, but I have to do a lot of things that it seems it does take away. It degrades the image too somehow. Does it take away pixels or something?
Well, it depends on what you're doing. So I guess the easy way, so what I was saying about the, raw image versus the JPEG image, and so this is, just to be clear with everyone, this is actually a setting that you set in your camera, how your images are going to be taken. And if you set the JPEG one, the camera basically takes the picture in the raw, but then does its edits and cooks it together as a JPEG itself. But so when we're talking about a raw image, there's no degradation at all. It's because you have that full-size original there and you're never actually touching it. You can edit it, do what you want to it, edit it all over the place. Whereas with a JPEG, you're going to be losing stuff through the saving process. You're quite literally just pressing it smaller and smaller and smaller every time. But one thing, like when you talk about actual palpable loss of quality, when you're cropping pictures, you are literally cutting away information and quality as well. So if you're doing a lot of cropping, the further you go, the less quality your picture is going to have, for example. But yeah, and then just on top of, I guess, not just talking about cropping, certain things, and again, if you have your raw image, it doesn't happen, but if you're editing with JPEG, certain things, because you have that limited amount of information, certain things can be quite destructive. So if you try to raise the shadows, make the shadows in a picture brighter, for example, shadows are very dark areas. The dark areas, the darkest and the brightest areas of an image don't have a lot of information in them, right? And so the more you try to like pull those shadows and brighten them up, the more it's going to reveal that there's actually nothing there. So you'll be getting like grain, and you'll see some banding, and you'll see the weirdness happening, basically. Like it will visibly lower the quality if you go too far on a lot of these things. Does that kind of answer?
Yes, and that's what I'm worried about. I mean, because I have older images of work that, because I can't take the photographs again, and they weren't good photos, and I need to do something with them,
Yeah.
but I'm worried about what will happen.
So
Yeah.
the easiest solution for that, honestly, is to have a complete backup of it where, like, you know, you've
Yeah.
got all of those pictures, you put them in a folder somewhere, and you leave them and you don't touch them. And then you have copies of all of them, and you always just make copies and work on the copies. Right?
Right.
Then you
Right.
don't have that risk, right? And I
Right.
mean, it's always good to have our stuff backed up. I keep talking about raw images being better because you can do all of the editing, but in the end, if I accidentally delete it, it doesn't matter how non-destructive my editing is, picture's still gone, right?
Yeah.
So it's still worthwhile especially if you can't rephotograph these things. It's very worthwhile to have them somewhere safe, to have backups of them. And that will also, because you can make a copy, Michelle, of your original image without ever opening it or editing it. Like, you can literally, on a computer, you know, you do the right click, copy paste or whatever, right? And you just get a carbon copy of it. And that's not going to affect your original.
Yeah.
So you can constantly be pulling copies from that original. Just never, like, in those scenarios where you have no access to do it again, and you want to, I would say, even if you're absolutely confident in your editing, you probably want to be editing a copy anyway.
Right.
Something can always go wrong, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
That's
And then this just that brings up, to sort of build on that, going in a little bit of a different direction, though. I said the words non-destructive editing. And so
Yep.
that's one of the things that we like layers for the most when we're editing photos, and that I like these bits of software for. So destructive editing is when you make a change to the base information on the picture. And in the sense of, I'm editing raw, for example, so you actually can't really edit the raw. And so what I do is I make my base adjustments, my brightness, my color, everything in Lightroom, we'll say, and then I export that image into Photoshop where I want to do a deeper edit retouch. That actually changes it already. It gives me a different file format, either TIFF, which I already mentioned, or a format called PSD, which is the Photoshop file. It's a working file. And those things you can change and you can manipulate. So there are different functions if you're working with a program like Photoshop, where you can just go into the menu and say, I want to change the brightness. And you change the brightness, and that's it. And you go, oh, that's a little bit too bright. But you have now baked that brightness into it. You have permanently changed the brightness. So it's like that image started that bright out of the camera. So you're going to have less quality if you try to change it back. Whereas when we're talking about the layers in any editing software, if you add a different layer, so right, this is another like piece of the transparent overhead projector stuff, paper, what are those things called? Jesus, I have a whole bunch of them beside me. Anyway, so it's essentially putting that on top, and then you change the brightness on top of that, and you say, oh, I don't like that. You can just take that and throw it out. But your base image has never changed. So when I talk about non-destructive, this is super, super important, that when you're editing photos, you are working on non-destructive photo editing. And that's worthwhile. There are, stupidly, if anyone's using Photoshop, the main, like, what seems to be the main places to do these adjustments, where you go into the menu and you find all of the different adjustments you want, all of those are destructive. You actually have to learn how to do it non-destructively. So it's something that's worth looking into as well for the specific program that you're using. It's really important if you want to essentially avoid these like catastrophic mistakes.
yeah.
It can be quite catastrophic.
Yes,
Trust me.
yes, yes.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but also so you guys don't feel as bad when it happens. This is like, when I'm talking about this topic, I'm just getting flooded with memories of learning how to do this stuff in school, and like all the times before I actually started going to school And when I was trying to teach myself Photoshop, all of the mistakes I made, all the pictures I ruined, all the things I lost, all of that like pain and suffering and putting hours and hours into something only to make one stupid mistake and have it be completely gone. It's awful, but it happens, and it happens to every single person who's getting into this process. It's so overwhelming that you will definitely forget certain things, and these things will happen. So don't feel bad, because it happens to everyone. Anyway, any other questions? Kathy's unmuted, so I'm wondering.
No, I have no questions. I was just playing around and got my volume back on.
No problem. I'm sorry for calling you out on that. It was not
No,
intentional.
that's okay.
Uh,
No,
okay.
I was
Yep.
going to say too, with my stuff, I don't have any editing program per se, but on my laptop, I just have Preview.
Yep.
So I usually play around, have just sort of played around in there and done very cursory adjustments to my pictures. However, I'm just dealing with black and white. So
Okay.
it's a little bit less complicated.
A little bit, yeah.
And then the other thing that I have done is in my photos, I have duplicated my originals, like on my laptop,
Yeah.
and then played around with my duplicates and always kept my original. And then if I don't like it, I throw it out.
That's perfect. That's exactly what I want
it's
everyone
just-
to be doing.
It's pretty basic what I do right now.
Yeah, but that's great, and that's the best way to learn, right? Because you learn more from your mistakes than your successes. So playing around and making those mistakes, and so having those backups is so unbelievably important. It's really hard to understate or to say it, I guess, to drive it home. It's so important that you're not losing your images and that you still have the chance to play around. Kathy, I do have a question for you. You said you're using Preview. Are you editing directly in Preview, or are you using photos?
Well, when I take my images and I download them, upload them to my laptop.
Yeah.
When I go to manipulate my photographs in Photos, in my Photos file.
Okay.
It's a basic, I think it's a program that is built right into my laptop as a basic program. It's called Preview.
Yeah,
So,
no, I have both of those as well. Actually, I'm just going to, I will quickly, I've got this open. So
it's very basic, very basic.
Computer do you have, Kathy?
I have an Apple laptop.
Right. And so you do have iPhoto?
So
Yes.
that's what I mean. That's what's now called Photos.
Okay.
It's just changed the name.
Yes. So you can, so that's what you can do some editing in.
So I'm gonna show you that because I'm on a Mac right now, and so you'll have to bear with me because I did not quite prep that for this right now. So you're gonna get a random picture of camping. Enjoy. It's not exciting, but it exists. I'm just going to. Oh, there it is. Just need to share my screen again. So you should be able to see, my whole screen now, so I can switch back and forth. So this is Photos. Right?
Yes.
This is the program that that Apple uses natively to show you and catalog your pictures. And then this one is Preview, which is essentially your PDF viewer. So this I found this is such a funny thing that I was experimenting with once I started putting together this workshop actually, and I didn't realize. So Kathy, are you using this one to edit?
No.
Using this one?
This is not what I see. What I do is I click on a photograph. I don't open it up. I just click on it, identify it, and then I go up into my dashboard on the top, and I choose duplicate.
Yeah, yeah,
So
I get that.
I duplicate the photograph. Then I go back into my photos and I actually open up the duplicate
Yeah.
photo. And then when I open it up, it says edit.
Good, like this.
And
Yeah,
then when I
exactly.
open up edit, then I've got very basic functions like I can crop, I can adjust, saturation, choose whether I'm brightening or
Yeah, okay.
emphasizing light and dark. So
Okay.
it's
So
built into the computer, I
I think
guess.
you actually probably just have a different version than I do, because this is all
Yeah.
updated, changed a little bit recently, but it is the same thing. So
Yeah.
this right now, I've opened this photo in preview. And this, I'm trying not to go down a rabbit hole, but to actually show you guys some of the functions of the easier programming. So here, it's a little bit harder to get to, I find, but I found this somewhere. And so I do have these like levels are brightness and essentially the brightness and the blacks and the whites. So it has some auto functions, and then you can adjust your exposure, right? And you can do those basic things. And so that is definitely, at this point as well, this is more or less a destructive edit, depending on how you save it, right? So I believe now I can edit this picture. When I go to save it, I think if I go to export, then I can save it, like I can export it as a second photo, as a copy. But if I were to just save, or even accidentally just save, then it's going to affect, actually, I don't need, this was just a picture I did for the presentation. So if I click on save, and then I'm going to close this picture, or close this whole program, I believe when I go back to it, it should be that awful super contrasty, overexposed. So I just ruined this picture, right? Because I didn't export it specifically. I didn't make a different copy of it. This is the only one I have.
Okay.
And I just ruined it. That's it.
Okay.
There's no going back. Okay. So
Okay.
super worth noting. Actually, is there going back? Oh, okay. I lied a little bit, but that's only because Apple's smart. No, so there is the revert to. This revert to function, I don't know if it'll give us everything forever. But there is currently another one. But that's not something. Oh no, that's the wrong one. I don't know if you guys can see all this. But anyway, this is not something I would trust. You've baked these edits into this picture, so you do want your copy. But anyway, so this is probably the most basic. Like preview is a PDF viewer, right?
Right.
That's all it's meant to do. It's anyone who has a Windows computer, or who has ever gotten a document from the Yukon government knows that knows about Adobe Acrobat, which is essentially the same thing. Preview is actually a bit of a lower. I find like you don't have as much function as Adobe Acrobat. However, it works great for reading PDFs, but it does have some really, really basic stuff in it. Also including, I don't know why that just happened like that. Oh, I know what I did. Including a crop function and a resize function. So what I was saying before that I just realized is the resize functioning seems to be easier in preview than in photos, but the editing in photos, Kathy, especially if you're using Apple, the editing functions in photos are better. You can do more with it.
Okay, what I'm seeing right now on the screen, that's what I can do. That's what I use.
Okay,
right
so
there.
this is photos.
The mountain climber picture.
Yeah.
That's
so
what I've got.
That's the Apple photo viewer program and catalog program, and they have this is usable, right? This is not going to be. This is not Photoshop. As you can see, these are very basic things, but it's still usable. And we were talking about white balance, for example. I can adjust that in here, and I can even I don't have one in front of me right now, so it's hard. Actually, maybe I can actually open one quickly. I just want to show you that function with the white balance, and you can even do that in here. And I think that's super cool. Oh, it's not going to let me. Hold on. You guys can watch this. It's okay. You'll see all of the editing secrets. So I'm currently opening Capture One, which is the program, the software I use. Speaking of, different software, I'm just looking for this number right now, but 3753. Different prices and so on and so forth. This is a subscription-based software, and I think it costs about $25 a month. So but this is considered like a pretty high level one. And the reason I say that is so that you can get kind of a feeling for when we're talking about software costing money. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. My computer, this is the next thing. So raw photos, I take all of my pictures in RAW. Even this here, you can see it. This one was taken with an iPhone, so this is iPhone RAW, which is why photos can look at it. But the other one is from a Fuji camera, which Apple doesn't have the support for raw Fuji files. So that's why it told me that photos couldn't open that picture. So when I say that RAW is really like the most basic format, it could not be opened in this program at all, right?
Okay.
But you're not going to be using this program if you're using a high-end DSLR camera, right? And it does read the iPhone pictures. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to show this one function, but basically if I click with the eyedropper, this is not gray, which is why the color doesn't look good, but you see there, that's gray. So I'm looking for a pretty neutral gray here, and everywhere I click, depending on the color I click on, it's going to change the colors in the picture.
Yeah.
So that is, Elena, that's exactly what you're doing with the gray card as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, thank you very much.
And I know Kathy has issues with white, so I'll bet instead of looking for the neutral gray, she could click white on there. And then,
does this have?
Does it? No.
The thing is, the neutral gray is what tells the program and the computer what white is. That's kind of the issue, is that we're trying to find white. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's why it uses the gray. So again, as I said, like if you want it to be perfect, you need the external tools, and that's just how it is. But like what I've told people before in workshops is these, the newer MacBooks they call the color space gray, for example. That gray is super close to what you need. You don't want the too dark ones, but like the laptop I'm using right now, I have literally laid it down before in a picture and used it as a gray card. It's not perfect, but it's closer than nothing. And if you're not doing a complete color reproduction, then you can also just find the one that looks the best, right? Especially if you're doing like sculptures or an art installation that you're photographing. You can so if there's something great, I've literally used people's hair before, because that gray has gotten me closer to what the color actually looked like than the camera did in that moment, right? Yeah. And it's much less important if you're doing black and white. Don't completely discount it though. Depending on how you photographed the black and white or how you've made it black and white, the colors in the background, or the colors, the initial ones that were in the image, can often affect how the gray tones come out in the picture. So to very super quickly explain that, if I go into this program, if I turn this picture black and white here, there are different ways to make something black and white. The most common one would be, the easiest would be to go and turn down the saturation. If you're desaturating everything, there's no color left in it, right? And then you have no real control over it anymore. Whereas a better editing suite has a black and white function. And I tell it to turn black and white. And then I can go to the individual different colors that are in the image, and I can turn up and down the sort of brightness of those and affect a lot of things in my picture that way. Does everyone see that? Does that make sense? That probably doesn't make much sense, but anyway, so that's why I'm saying, like, don't completely discount white balance or the colors that are in the picture just because you're doing black and white. I'm going to do a test here. I'm going to completely change the white balance, and we'll see how it changes the black and white image. There we go. Right? So all I'm doing right now is changing the color of the light that's hitting that picture. And even in black and white, that's changing it. Okay, so since we're doing another couple hours next week, and that's sort of where I'd planned to do a bit more hands-on type of stuff, what would you guys like to do for our last 10 minutes? Should we chat? I have this handout that I could quickly go through so you guys know what you're looking at if you like, or I can answer questions or show specific things, whatever anyone wants.
Is there something, Erik, that you would like the participant to practice on between now and the next time they will see you?
I think the most important thing for me would be that they get sort of that conversation that we had in the beginning about about what tools are the right ones to kind of figure that out. Like, what camera are you going to be using and what software are you going to be using, and try to figure out how those two things are compatible and what you have. Like, so there's not a one specific thing, but like what functions, what capabilities. Like, look at the software that you're going to be using the most, at least for now, and see what makes sense to you in it, what you can understand in it, so that if there are things, you can also come back to me then with more very specific questions, for example, and we can talk through them and we can work through them. And to really sort of identify those goals for yourself. What is it exactly that, I mean, on a more high level than I want to get better at photo editing or I want to take pictures of my art. Quite a bit more specific, like Elena saying about, scanning the pictures and then from there doing the color correction and then from there exporting them for the size for print. That type of specific, right? This is my goal. And the more of that you know, and the more of that you even think about, it's already going to start opening things up for you based on what we've talked about today. And it'll help you sort of understand where you're at and what you need better. So just that, figuring that stuff out, and then looking at the tools that you have at hand. And maybe even, if anyone has time for it, look at what other tools are available for what you have. So if you're, let's just stick with a smartphone for a moment. If you're using a smartphone, maybe look at some different editing apps and maybe see if there's something that's better for you than what... Oh, I'm still sharing my screen. That's funny. I didn't know that. Maybe look to see if there's something that's better for you than what you have currently been playing around with. For example, Kathy, you're using those programs right now that are built into Apple. Maybe one of the free bits of software might make more sense, might work better for you. So I do, in this little handout, I listed, and this is not even a little bit exhaustive. Oh my God, there are so many programs out there. But I just basically, I took, a couple of really popular ones, mostly the things that were on the top of my head, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I have a small thing with each one of them. And so there's a lot listed in there that you can have a look at. There is a specific spot for mobile apps. However, I have less of them on here just because I'm less familiar with them. And again, like, you're going to want to search, just do a Google search and figure out what it is you need. In my experience, Snapseed has been really good for completely free and a lot more powerful than what's built into the phone, for example. Also in this list, I probably have it written somewhere. Yeah, I do. So anything with an asterisk costs money, just so you know. And I started mentioning that and I totally got sidetracked. The way that photo editing software works is that you will... Hi, Grace. It's that you will... you either buy what's called a perpetual license. So you buy the software just like it used to be, where you always bought your software. You just paid, and sometimes it was expensive, but you paid it once. Or now subscription-based software is much, much, much more common. And there's the biggest pro and con to both. Like some of them have a choice, not many. Some, most of them force you into one or the other. Like Adobe only does subscription, which I personally like because for reasons I'll get into in a second. But what I don't like specifically about theirs is that you have to sign on for a year. You pay monthly, but if you after 3 months decide you don't want to use it anymore, then you have to buy it out. You essentially have to pay them the rest of the year, which is absolutely stupid. But again, it's a software that we can't get away with not using. But so there's the subscription based and the perpetual, and those two things are worth knowing about because a perpetual license typically doesn't involve any updates further than like bug fixes, right? They might do like version point something something something, we fixed this bug. But when they come out with new functions and new tools, you have to buy that again. And so that's why a lot of working photographers, at least, like the subscription system. I'm okay with it. You know, I've spent multiple thousands of dollars over the year, but it's a business expense, and I always have the most up-to-date version. Whereas if you're using a perpetual license of something, then you might, you know, in 5 years, you might be way behind the curve. So those are questions to ask yourself. We are talking about with subscription-based editing software, you're anywhere between like usually 10, but usually 15 to $30 a month. And with a perpetual software, typically it's somewhere, in my experience, around 250. Like gone are the days of, you know, people being asked to pay $2,000 for a piece of software, at least. But yeah, so it can be quite cost intensive. Keeping in mind, we're talking about art, not advocating for people to spend money, but this is something that you are potentially, you're wanting to up the quality of your images so that you can potentially be making more money off of your art or selling your art. So in that regard, it can be worthwhile, worth thinking about looking at your own situation and asking yourself, is it worth investing in this tool? Will this tool be able to help me? I mean, we all have tools for the job, right? So is this one that is worth spending money on? Or is this, you know, the hammer and a wrench set that you found at the free store that kind of works, you can make do, right? Like, so what works best for you? Yeah, so that's just there. That all being said, there are still plenty of free bits of software. Often they're not the most intuitive. I mean, if you consider it like there's always got to be some catch, right? They've got to pay to people to build these things. So with Adobe, you have a team of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of software engineers who are constantly working to upgrade this stuff. Whereas with an open source version, you've got people who are passionate about it doing it in their free time. You're going to have differences in the quality. But if you can get past that, it all pretty much does the same thing in the end. Mobile apps are a bit weirder because you're going to have, you know, you're going to want to look on your own what information the developer is taking from you if they're free. Nothing's free, right? And some of them, like Lightroom, does the semi thing, the Lightroom mobile, which I also don't love. I don't actually, since I have a subscription on my computer that connects it to my phone as well, so I don't actually know what it is that they don't give you, but I know they're known for that if you get the free version, there are some tools that you just can't use. So also worth looking into, because Lightroom Mobile, for example, is a better photo editing app than just using the built-in software on your iPhone. It's better. But are the available tools the ones that will actually help you, the ones that you actually need? Or are you going to download it, start editing your first picture and go, oh, well, I can't do that, and I can't do that, and I can't do that, right? Anyway, that was, again, a very long tangent. I'm really bad at these things, and I get worse at it when I start getting more tired. So the longer I go on these tangents, the worse they get. I apologize. Most of you have gone through this with me before, though, so it's nothing
I have
new.
a question.
Please.
Okay. I noticed the program that I have wants me to give the size, the output size that I want before when I import the image into the program.
Oh,
it-
that's
you know,
interesting.
So I'm wondering, what is the biggest size? Like so I can start big.
Okay. I can't remember. Are you using Corel?
Yeah.
Was that? Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
Corel, and it has
Unfortunately, I don't know anything about it, so we'll try to.
no. I
Okay.
just
Yeah. So let me tell you. You're using it on your computer, right?
yeah.
Okay. This is great. I've got something for you, Michelle. And do you have JPEG files? I guess it doesn't matter what files you have.
Yes.
So I'm gonna screen share again, and you're gonna see a lovely picture of my kids somewhere here. This little. So I've got this picture here. Okay. I think it's just a cell phone picture that was just imported onto my computer or sent to me. I don't even know how it got there. It's there. That's the file I want to work on. In your case, you want to know. So if I right click on it, and go to, on Apple, it's Get Info, and
Yes.
on Windows, it's Properties.
Right.
So when I go in here, I certainly hope I don't do you wrong with this. I should
Size
usually be able to see the dimensions of the photo.
I think it. Stop moving it around.
Well, I'm sorry. Was it up here? You thought you saw it?
I did size 4,000.
Yeah, that's different.
Okay.
What I'm looking for specifically is, I'm trying to think. Okay, I can very quickly show you. I have Photoshop open right now. So what I'm looking for specifically are pixels. So this picture is 8,256 pixels wide and 6,192 pixels high. This picture is very, 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 very big. It's probably, so we had, where was that now? So we had, here. This one is the one that I checked was 4.1 megabytes. That other one is probably 80 to 100 megabytes right now. Okay. Just so you know, like that size is huge. So what we want to find, here, geez, I found it. There we go. It's dimensions. That's what we're looking for.
Okay.
So dimensions, and that number, that says 3,024 by 4,032. So just to clarify, that the other one was also in a more raw form, but it is at least double the size of this, which we have. However, this is not to be scoffed at. Like, this is a good resolution, right? But so if you go in there and find the dimensions, this is the pixel size, just so you know.
Yeah.
All right. And so that will tell you what you want. Or that's what you want to put in. And I don't even know. I have never, Michelle, that has caught me off guard. I'll probably, if I find the time.
It up for you. I was saving it up.
Yeah, it's great. I would love to look into that and figure out what the hell is going on.
Yeah.
And
So-
why they want that.
So Eric, if the participants have questions, do you prefer them to they can send it to me in advance and I'll send them to you, or do you want, or just having the questions during the workshop works?
Unless somebody's going to come up with something like that again, geez. No, that's just a software. Michelle and I have already actually talked about that I'm quite unfamiliar with that software, and that is a very odd thing, but I don't think it's too difficult to find a pretty quick answer, so I'm happy to just address it as we go.
Okay. Thank you, Eric.
Awesome. So I hope everyone got a little bit of this tonight, and we will try to build on it next week.